Mr. President, this past weekend, the nation honored Justice Antonin Scalia. He was laid to rest after serving on the Supreme Court for nearly 3 decades. Marcel and I were at home in Vermont when we learned that Justice Scalia had passed, and frankly, we were stunned by the news. I do not often agree with Justice Scalia, but he was a brilliant jurist with a deep commitment to our country and to the Constitution, and we'd enjoyed a friendship for decades. He'll be remembered as one of the most influential justices in modern history. While his family and all should have had a chance to mourn his passing, I was shocked in the immediate wake of his death. Senate Republicans moved quickly to shut down the constitutionally mandated process to fill the vacancy left on the Supreme Court within hours of his death being announced. They declared they would oppose any effort to confirm the next Supreme Court justice this year. Now, I've served in this body longer than any member here, and I've heard some shocking things during that time. But I'm surprised by the political crassness of these statements. Before a nominee had even been named, some Republicans reflexively decided to prematurely reject anyone nominated by the president. This impulsive rush to judgment runs completely contrary to how this body has always treated nominees to the highest court in the land. And Republicans should not allow the hyper-partisan rhetoric of the campaign trail to trump one of the Senate's most important constitutional duties. I've talked with the president, and I know he will fulfill his constitutional duty. He will nominate an individual to bring the Supreme Court back to full strength, and of course, he should. And the president has already begun consulting with members of both parties in the Senate. But after a nomination has been made, we in the Senate should get to work and do our jobs, the jobs we are elected to do. I was all over my state of Vermont last week. Vermonters I spoke with last week reflect Americans across the country. They're tired of partisan political games. They're chipping away at the foundation of our constitutional democracy. I heard this from both Republicans and Democrats in Vermont. As Oliver Goodenough, a law professor at Vermont Law School, wrote this week in the Rutland Herald, an extended Supreme Court vacancy because the Senate was unwilling to actually do their work would, quote, certainly create a constitutional embarrassment, close quote. And I ask unanimous consent that a copy of his op-ed from February 21 be included in the record. Thank you. Well, we must not let that dysfunction infect the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's an independent, co-equal branch of government that was designed to be above politics. The next nominee to the Supreme Court deserves full and fair consideration by the Senate. That includes a timely hearing and then have an up or down vote. Now, I'm worried that even before President Obama took office, and ever since then, even after he was reelected by a 5 million vote plurality, there's been an unrelenting and cynical campaign by some hyper-partisans to delegitimize the president's authority. They were the birthers, and there have been and still are spurious slurs of all kinds. Outside this body, the efforts to undermine President Obama's constitutional authority to fill the Supreme Court vacancy draw some of their vehemence and venom from these dark corners. But every one of us took an oath of office, every one of us, and we're sworn to uphold the Constitution. We're sworn to uphold our constitutional duties. Let us not be intimidated and pressured to avoid our sworn duty. Let us act for the good of the American people and for the good of this great nation. Now, some have justified their call for unprecedented obstruction by claiming that's because the American people need a voice. Give me a break. The American people have spoken. Millions of Americans, an overwhelming majority of Vermonters, voted in record numbers in 2008 and again in 2012 to elect President Obama. In doing so, they granted him constitutional authorities for all 8 years of those terms. You don't elect a president for 1 year or 2 years or 3 years. You elect a president for 4 years at a time. And just saying that President Obama is a lame duck president does not make it true. In fact, next election is not till way at the end of this year in November. The American people expect those they elected to do their jobs for their entire terms. That means both in the Senate and in the White House. They don't expect senators to say, well, we can't vote on anything this year because it's an election year. We'll collect our full salary, but we're not going to vote on anything. American people don't like that. Now, it's rare that a vacancy in the Supreme Court arises during election year. It is just false to say that justices do not get confirmed in presidential election year. More than a dozen Supreme Court justices have been confirmed in a presidential election year. I think of one of those I voted on. The Democrats led the Senate during President Reagan's final year in office, and we voted for President Reagan's nominee, and he's confirmed by a Democratic-led Senate during the president's final year in office. He'd received a hearing and a confirmation vote. It would be the height of hypocrisy to say we shouldn't apply the same process with a Democrat in the White House and Republicans in control of the Senate. We can't say we'll follow our constitutional duties and do our work if we have a Democratic-controlled Senate and a Republican president, but we can't do it if it's the other way around. Now, some Republican senators have acknowledged the next Supreme Court nominee should receive a fair hearing, but the process can't end there. I have served on the Judiciary Committee for 36 years. During my time on the committee, we have never refused to send a Supreme Court nominee to the full Senate for a confirmation vote, even in those cases where a majority of the committee had opposed the nomination. We still reported the nominee to the full Senate. And once reported to the full Senate, every Supreme Court nominee has received an up or down confirmation vote during my 40 years in the Senate. We have to uphold this bipartisan tradition for the next Supreme Court nominee because so much is at stake. Merely holding a hearing without a full committee process and a confirmation vote is insufficient for a Supreme Court nominee. It would just be a charade, and it'd be an avoidance of our constitutional duties. If Republicans refuse to uphold their constitutional responsibility to consider the next Supreme Court nominee, I believe it harms our constitutional system of government. If they succeed in deliberately holding open a seat in the Supreme Court for more than a year, they'll be intentionally disabling the court's ability to fulfill its constitutional role. And Republicans will be harming the Supreme Court for more than a year. Justice Scalia once wrote that a Supreme Court of just 8 justices risks the possibility the court will find itself unable to resolve the significant legal issues presented by the case. The legal issues before the Supreme Court are significant. The importance of a single vote in the court cannot be overstated. One vote in the Supreme Court decided landmark cases concerning our campaign finance laws, clean water, air policies, marriage equality, voting rights. Americans deserve a fully functioning Supreme Court. Mr. President, I've traveled all over my state, I've traveled all over this country. I've talked with Republicans and Democrats alike. And what I know from my fellow Americans that makes me so proud, they show up for work and they do their jobs. Americans don't have the luxury of telling their bosses that instead of doing their jobs, they would rather delay, delay, delay. If they did, they'd probably be fired. Well, the United States Senate shouldn't tell the American people, we're not going to do our jobs. We'll delay, delay, delay. The stakes are too high. The American people actually expect us to show up for work and do our job. So let's get to the work, do the job the American people sent us here to do. And maybe we may want to reread our oath to uphold the Constitution. It requires no less. Mr. President, I have asked unanimous consent that Mara Greenberg and Colleen Zenkotita Bengoa, detailees of the Senate Judiciary Committee, be granted Senate floor privileges for the duration of the 114th Congress.
Without objection.
And Mr. President, put my full statement and the op-ed piece I referred to in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I don't see others on the floor about to speak out, so I will yield the floor, and we do. You know, we have allowed this whole process to become far too partisan. I'm a lawyer, as a former prosecutor. I've argued cases in state court, in federal courts, in federal trial courts, and federal appellate courts. When I've gone to federal courts, I've always thought the beauty of this, whether they're Republican or Democratic nominees, I felt I could get a fair hearing. And I thought it was a great honor to go there. People come from other parts of the world, they talk about our federal judiciary as an example for them. I recall when a country that had been under dictatorship changed to a more democratic form, and several of their people came to my office and asked about our judicial system. And they said, is it true that in the United States of America, people can actually sue their government? I said, it does. That happens all the time. And they said, well, is it true that sometimes the government loses? I said, it happens all the time. And they said, well, then do you replace the judge when that happens? I said, no, they're independent. It was like a light bulb going on. They realized what a difference we are. Think of the image we send to the rest of the world as well as 300 million Americans. If we say, no, we're going to politicize the Supreme Court, the court that is supposed to be the final arbiter on constitutional questions. Look at what it sends to them and say, yes, we have time to take more recesses this year than I think the Senate ever has, so that I could ever remember. But we don't have time to do the job we're elected to do, the job we are paid to do, and vote on, have a hearing on, and vote on a Supreme Court nominee. Mr. President, American people, they have a job. They can't pick and choose when they'll bother to show up. And they can't say, I know this is what I'm supposed to do in this job, but I don't feel like it. Or I have a partisan reason not to do it. I'm going to sit this out, see me next year, and I may do my job. Nobody would accept that. But that's really what is happening. Republican leadership saying, no, we want to sit this out. We don't want to do our work. We don't want to do our job. See us next year, maybe we will then. No. That's never happened in election year. Had at least a dozen Supreme Court vacancies during election year, and a dozen times the Senate, no matter who was president, came together and handled the nominee and got them confirmed. Why did senators do that in the past? Probably because they figured they had been elected, they were being paid by the American people, it was part of their job, and so they show up and do their job. Are we now going to change what has been the precedent ever since the beginning of this country and say, oh, we're better than that? We don't have to do our job? You keep paying us, but we don't have to do our job, even though we've taken an oath to uphold the Constitution and do our job? Even Justice Scalia has said that would be wrong. You shouldn't have an 8-member Supreme Court. And we don't. So let's actually show up. Do the job we are elected to do. Do the job we are paid to do. Do what every other American has to do. They have to show up for work. They have to do their job. They can't say, I don't feel like it this year. I'll see you next year. Oh, by the way, send me my paycheck. That's not the American way. It should not be the Senate way. President, I yield the floor to Jesse Absalom.